Let's go back to one of our top stories now. And homeowners are being warned of a further interest rate rise, possibly two by now and the end of the year. One of Australia's big four banks is forecasting one or two more hikes. So joining me now is the Shadow Finance Minister Jane Hume. Jane, this warning comes from NAB, an upgrade just a week after the budget. Can you really link the two, do you think?
Well, I don't think you can unlink the two. Certainly we saw the priority of reducing inflation specifically removed from the fiscal objectives and strategy of this budget, just as we saw at the last October budget, the removal of an objective of balanced budgets over the medium term, which I think is actually a failure of this government to do what it needs to do. When you've had inflation with a 7 in front of it 3 quarters in a row, removing the objective of reducing inflation is really irresponsible, because inflation is that thief in the night that erodes your purchasing power, that eats away at your savings, that keeps real wages low and reduces your standard of living. Surely the objective of a responsible government is to improve the standard of living of all Australians.
Yeah, let's talk about housing more generally now, because some backbenchers are pushing for changes to negative gearing, limiting it to just one property that can be negatively geared. Do you think that's a good idea?
This is interesting, isn't it? I heard that this was one of the issues raised as a policy idea at the Labor Party policy convention. And it's not as if we haven't heard this before. This is, we've seen this film before. I think it's Back to the Future. This does sound an awful lot like Bill Shorten's broad taxing objective. Let's remember, Laura, that just 1 year ago, in fact this time last year, Anthony Albanese was looking Australians in the eye saying there will be no new taxes. Well, since then we've seen taxes on superannuation, changes to the franking credit regime, now a tax on farmers, now a tax on truckies. Both of those came out in this recent budget, and now we're talking about changes to negative gearing as well. This is sounding very much like the broken promise that all of those other tax changes are. So, look, this is not surprising. We also know that the Greens were pushing this very policy as part of as a condition to supporting the Housing Australia Future Fund. So, I don't think that this is. I think there's too many eerie coincidences here.
But is it a good idea?
Well, let's have a look at what this policy entails. Are we talking about negative gearing on new properties or only existing properties? Is it only on residential properties, or is it on commercial properties as well? Is it retrospective or prospective? There's no details here. So let's have a look at what this policy would mean.
I mean, in general, we've got a perfect opportunity to have a conversation about this in the lead up to the next election. Do you think negative gearing can be looked at, should be tinkered with?
Don't you think, though, Laura, what it's really doing is avoiding the real issue, which is housing supply. And the only way you can open up housing supply is to get the states on board. Now, if you're in government, as Anthony Albanese is at a federal level, and you've got every state and territory but one in Tasmania, but every state and territory on the mainland, surely this is the opportunity to bang the heads together of those premiers and say, let's open up supply, because that is the only way you can sustainably make housing more accessible and more affordable for more Australians, particularly if you've got those high net migration numbers coming in. You have to make sure that you've got somewhere for new migrants to live, but also you've got to make sure that you don't lower the standard of living for Australians that are already here. You've got to make sure that you've got the infrastructure to support that migration figure as well. Net migration is a good thing, but you have to make sure you've got housing and infrastructure sorted at the same time.
I want to just finally talk about the Victorian Liberal Party, Moira Deeming's expulsion. She's told Peter Credlin last night that her expulsion is essentially confusing, disappointing for Conservative female voters. What do you say to that?
Well, I heard that Moira Deeming asked the question that the Liberal Party clearly wants a certain type of woman in its ranks. And that's kind of true. We want women that are going to be team players. We want women that are going to support the leader and help develop and articulate policies that reflect the views and values of mainstream Australia and that will help make mainstream Australia's lives better. That's the kind of woman we want in the ranks of the Liberal Party. I think that Moira knew that the day she signed up.
Yeah, so essentially it's because she's not a team player?
Well, look, can you imagine what would happen if I tried to sue Peter Dutton? I don't think that's the act of a team player.
Jane Hume, thanks so much for your time as always.
Great to be with you, Laura.